The data engineering roadmap for 2025, I'm going to give it to you all now. And so just to give you a little heads up as to how this works is I'm going to stitch together a bunch of my most popular videos that talk about every single round in the data engineer interviews. In 2025, the way you get a higher paying data job is by landing the interview. It's really that simple. And so here are my best videos for every round. Let me know how you like it. Here's exactly why you keep applying to a bunch of jobs and you are not hearing back. So by the end of this video, I'm going to give you 3 things that you must do with your resume and 1 thing that you absolutely have to avoid. 3 big to-dos, 1 big don't. Let's start with the to-dos. So you can see here a real resume from John Smith. He is a fake name of a real client, but this is actually a real resume. And so what I wanted to show you was a few things that we did with this resume. And by the way, what's really important to note is that this person went from non-tech to tech. And so we've done this countless amount of times with people from all ranges of experience. But here are the 3 things that this person specifically did that worked really, really well. So number 1, I call it beef up the top section. So here's the little thing, the little nugget that a lot of people don't realize about recruiters is that they very rarely go past the top half of the resume. That's why they always say make the resume 1 page, because they're very rarely going to scroll down to the bottom half. So when we say beef up the top section, we're talking about this, the skills section. So specifically, this is done for 2 reasons. Number 1 is because things like AI are going to look for keywords. And number 2, just like we said, the recruiters aren't going to look past the bottom half. So with this, you'll be able to get past the initial screening of AI by just putting the keywords of the actual tools that you have experience with. Now, that one seems pretty simple. I think most people knew about it. Here's the one little change that you can make that is actually going to make a massive difference in where the recruiter looks. And it's called a title change. And so what I mean by that is when recruiters look at a resume, let's say they're hiring for a data engineer position, right? What they're going to do is they're going to look at your most recent experience. They're going to look at the title of that experience. And if you have something like a data analyst here, then they might not even look at the rest of it. And I know you might be thinking it kind of sounds irresponsible to not look at the rest of the resume, but the reality is that's just how it goes. So in this instance, we did this with a different resume, is that instead of having consulting, because we knew we were applying for a data engineer position, we actually changed the title of that position to what we were going for. So you can actually do this and create multiple resumes. So whenever you hear people saying like, hey, I've personalized a resume, I create a bunch of resumes, what they mean is they might have changed that one specific title. And it actually makes a huge difference. Now, the third thing that you really should do is a concept that I like to call congruency. So let me give you an example. Do you see here in the bullet points where the person used AWS Kinesis, and they also had the tool, the Kinesis tool, in the skill section? You know what's funny, looking at this now, I'm not even sure this person had Kinesis in there, which was a mistake. But that is one thing that you can do, is you can take this AWS, you can expand it to all the AWS sections or all the AWS tools, and then you can actually have them inside of your bullet points. So what a lot of people do wrong is they have, let's say, AWS in the skill section, but then they don't include it in the bullet points, right? So this actually represents a lack of congruency. And to the recruiter, this is a massive red flag, because it mentions, it tells the recruiter, hey, this person might have done a course or a certificate or something on this AWS tool, but they didn't actually work on that AWS tool in their previous project. And so you might not actually get the brownie points that you were hoping for especially if they have some of these tools in the job description. So those are the three massive levers we've seen. And just to do a quick little recap, number one, beef up the section. Number two, we talked about the title change. And then number three, we talked about having congruency. Now, what is the biggest do not do? Well, the biggest don't is actually one that I see 80% of clients do. You'd be shocked. And it's called not showing off the latest experience. And so what this means is, if you look at this resume, you can see that the last experience that this person had, they worked there for 3 years. That has a lot more bullet points than the previous year. And this is for two reasons. Number one, well, this person might have worked there a little longer. But number two, and most importantly, remember what I said in the beginning of this video, that recruiters don't look at the bottom half? Well, the truth is, if they do go a little bit lower, it's typically going to be because this section is still their most recent experience. And that's what they're looking for. I can't tell you how many times people have a short section up top, a very long section up here, right? If this is the resume, and you can say these are the skills right here, right? But what is so weird is that this has like 5 years of experience and this has like 2. And I'm just like, this has to be the opposite, because what happens here is that the recruiter starts to wonder, were they just goofing off the last 5 years? Were they at a company where they can rest and vest, right? Where it's basically, you just stay there to collect the equity and not really work hard. And so this is actually a massive red flag. So do not do this. Make sure this section is a lot bigger and make sure it actually has all the tools in this part along with a very good title, and you should be good.
How we can quantify your resume and your behavioral questions. This is a question I get a lot from clients. They get very confused, and oftentimes it is why their resume is in the bottom 50, 60 percentile, when in reality, this is something that you do already in your job. You just have to communicate it. By the end of this video, you're going to have 5 frameworks to show what kind of impact you really made in your business. Number 1, costs. So when I say costs, this is typically what engineers think of. They say, hey, we have this, ETL pipeline, right? We have this data pipeline that we built, and it is using up 10 hours of processing every day, right? And for any engineers, you already know 10 hours of processing means, a cost for all of that processing power. So if you can find a way to build the same pipeline for 5 hours, right, then that means you basically just cut cost in half, right? So this is a very simple one. This could be anything like, took the SQL query, right? This is a very simple one, but I took the SQL query, I optimized it, right? That's the word. I optimized it. It was able to run in half the time. And because of that, the compute, that's the very technical term, the compute was cut in half. And because the compute was cut in half, that means the bill that we got was cut in half, right? It's kind of like saying, hey, I have electricity that I use every day. I have a light that I use every day in my home. I'm going to use it half the time. I'm going to turn off the light and use it 50% of the time, which means your electricity bill will be 50% less. So that's really simple. That's the one that most engineers are able to get. Now, the second one, engineers know less, but it's still pretty frequent. This is called labor. So what does labor mean? Well, very simple, right? This is another word for it is automation. And so, for example, you have to think that, hey, when I create this report and automate this report, how much time am I saving? And I'll give you one example in my own business, right? We have salespeople, right? Well, salespeople have to do manual submission of their activities at the end of every day, right? And so one of the things that they were doing was saying, hey, this is how our conversation went with this prospect, that prospect, etc. But what we figured out is that, let's just take this as an example. If we have 15 reps and we each are spending 30 minutes a day, that means that they're probably spending 7 hours per day. And again, let's just say they work 20 hours a month. This is 140 hours per month, right? And so automating that report alone, let's just say that somebody's getting paid $100 an hour, right? To keep it simple, that's 14 grand in savings per month. So that means per year, again, I know the math is wrong, but let's just say this one task that took somebody maybe a few hours to implement, saved the company $200,000 in man hours, in labor. That's called automation. That's how you remove the human element out of it to cut costs in terms of labor. And again, it doesn't mean you just cut the people, right? It doesn't mean you fire them. What it means is now they have more time to do other revenue generating activities. So very simple. That's number 2. That is labor. Number 3, we are going to do users. So what does users mean? How do you quantify your impact in terms of users? So with users, what you want to do is you want to quantify how many people are using your product, your service, right? And so, for example, if you create a dashboard and you have, let's say, you have 20 dashboards at the company, right? Sorry for the sloppy handwriting. Well, the reality is there's going to be some dashboards that are more popular among your direct reports, your team members, your colleagues, your bosses, right? So if you can say, hey, I was in the top 3 of dashboards because it had 100 people looking at it every day and they viewed it on average 3 times a day, right? So 100 people 3 times a day, that means it got, 300 views, right, per day. So you can say, hey, this generated 10,000 views per month. Believe it or not, this is a really good way for you to quantify your impact and tell your bosses, hey, I'm working on things that matter to the company. Because then we can say, hey, these things had other downstream impacts. And we'll talk about that in number 5. But 10,000 views, and then you can say, well, on average, right, most dashboards get about 1,000 views, per month or whatever. And then you're saying, hey, those 10,000 views are really, really impactful. So this is one a lot of people I don't think about, user/usage, or another word for this in the tech world is engagement, right? And everybody kind of has this idea of engagement as like, hey, how are my, customers engaging with my product? But the reality is, if you're an engineer or an analyst, sometimes your customers are actually your colleagues, your employees, your direct reports, your bosses, your stakeholders, etc. So when you view it from that lens, meaning they are your customers, this is one metric that I think most engineers don't think about. So moving on, the 4th is members. And this is actually related to the above, right? If we know that usage and engagement is one thing, we also know that members, meaning how many people and teams use your product. And I'll give you an example. If you're a data analyst, the example above is, the example above is relevant, the dashboard. But if you're a data engineer, the example I would use is the table, right? If you create a table, you created a pipeline to generate that table, right? How many people are using it, right? How many queries per day, right? Like how many times are people doing an activity on that table, right? And by the way, if you have a CRM, if you're a sales team, it's the same thing. How many people are going to that report? How many people are refreshing it, right? I have a dashboard, not to, call out employees, but I have a dashboard that the data is always wrong or it's not updated, right? Or it's just doesn't look that good. So the brain doesn't process it that easy. So I view it maybe once a month, right? That dashboard is a lot less impactful than a different dashboard we have here that is like the whole team looks at it every single day. A easy leadership table tab, right? So that kind of stuff, it matters because how many people are looking at it, how many activities and engagement people have with that table, for example, right? It matters. So it's not just people, but it can also be teams, it can also be queries, but it can also be what I call cross functional teams. And this is a big one because if you work for a big tech company, right, and you have your one little group right here, right, whatever, let's say you're working on marketing, right? Well, the reality is if you build a table here, then other cross functional teams are like, wait, I want to use that table, right? That matters. And so if you're looking for promotion, this is how you tell your team, your boss, we have other teams, other organizations using my table because they found it so impactful. And then inside of this, you might have 100 people here, 100 people there, 100 people here. Now you have 300 people in a really big tech company using your table, which is often the case if you really build something of value. So just keep that one in mind. And let's go to number 5. Number 5 is revenue. And this one is hard for engineers and data analysts because they're like, oh, a salesperson can say, hey, I, instead of making 200 grand in sales this month, I made 300 grand. That was a 50% improvement because, this AI tool that I started using started doing this, and then my sales went up by 50%. That's really easy to quantify. Marketing, same thing. Hey, the return on ad spend went from 2x to 4x because of this one little tweak in the ad. It doubled everything. So this one is one that I see engineers and analysts always say, oh, I don't know how to quantify it. I don't think I can quantify it. You can quantify it. Okay, so how would we quantify revenue? Remember in step number 3 when I said the downstream impact, or even step number 4? Well, the reality is you can always say things like, hey, I created this dashboard or this table which led to this business decision, right? Or this business insight, right? And that business decision, this insight led to, some sort of lift, some sort of increase in revenue, in profit, etc. Here's where most engineers mess up. They don't know how to connect the business. They don't know what stakeholders are talking about behind closed doors to make those decisions based on the data they're looking at. This one's sounds like a no duh. And this is what most people think they need to do. But it's also the one that I see analysts and engineers having the trouble doing the most. So, how would you actually go about finding that impact? It sounds simple, but oftentimes, just ask. Ask your colleague, ask your manager, ask your manager's manager. Doesn't matter. Just ask. And this is where I think engineers and analysts struggle because they are typically tend to be less soft skills and they typically tend to be a little more introverted.
Here's why you're probably leaving 20 to 100 grand in compensation every single year by not negotiating. And so in this video, I'm going to show you exactly what you need to avoid saying, because then by the end of the video, you're going to find out exactly what you need to say and need to do in order to gain an extra 20, 30, 50, and in some cases, even 100 grand extra in compensation by only having to negotiate an extra 15, 30, 40 minutes of work once you get the offer. And it's the biggest lever that I see people just not making. And so before we get into the tips of, hey, what is it that you need to do? You need to first understand what is it that you shouldn't do. And so I'm going to write on this pad, and we can title it negotiation or whatever the case, but there are two main things that you need to avoid doing. Two things not to do when negotiating. Okay. So we'll call this negotiation module. We're going to go over what you should say in a little bit, but first is you have to understand what not to do. Okay. So the first thing you need to not do is number one, do not start negotiating too early. Now, what does this mean? A lot of people start negotiating on the recruiter round. They're in the first round. Recruiters are saying, hey, what are you looking to earn? And for some reason, a lot of people think that they're trying to negotiate. So they go way over. They do their research. They find that companies are willing to pay whatever, 160 to 250. And they say, hey, I want to make at least 270. And they think that that's going to help them. The problem with that is that at the beginning, you have zero leverage. You have no bargaining chips. There are exceptions. If you genuinely have an offer that's already 300 grand, yes, you should tell them because you don't want to waste their time. You don't want to waste your time. But in most cases and in most scenarios, people are simply negotiating at the beginning because they think it makes them look better and they think that they need to do it. But the reality is you don't need to do it. And companies will just turn you away because they don't want to waste their time. And I'm going to go over in a little bit how you can actually negotiate the right way and why companies will negotiate. I know it's everybody's fear that that companies won't negotiate, but they will. So, number two, what is the second thing you shouldn't do? Very simple. You shouldn't not negotiate. Or in other words, to turn the double negative, negotiate. Negotiate. And more specifically, the mistake we keep seeing people make no matter how much we tell them. And so hopefully this video helps a ton of people and you guys don't do it. Do not accept on the first offer. Okay. And when I say first offer, I mean in the first encounter. So if you get the offer and you get a phone call from a recruiter, do not accept on the spot. Okay. They 95% of the time are expecting you to negotiate. So before we move on, you might be wondering, well, what's the 5% of the time they're not expecting you to negotiate? And here's what we learned. What we learned is if they put the salary or the compensation, and we'll talk about why there's a difference between the two, in the job description, then they are basically saying, hey, we don't want to waste our time. This is what it is. Do not negotiate. And oftentimes, this right here is really only for contract positions. Because if they're doing contract positions, maybe they have less money and they really can't negotiate. For the big tech companies, by the way, they're typically ready to negotiate. So, with that said, let's move on to what you should do and how you should negotiate. So, the very first thing you need to do is you need to do your research. And I know this sounds simple. I know it's like, well, of course I'm going to do my research, but let me explain. The research should help you frame the negotiation at the front end, but not necessarily negotiate to the back end. So, what does that mean? If you get a job offer as a data analyst, for example, or a data engineer for, let's say, if you get an interview for Amazon and your research says that for those positions, you can make anywhere between 120 and 160K, right? But you really want a 180, maybe even 200. When you get to the recruiter round, what you need to do is you need to give a overlapping band. So something like this. So if they ask you like, hey, what is it that you're looking for? You can then say 140 to 180. Why? Why does this work? Very simple. A, you fall in their target. So what this means is they will not push you away. I cannot tell you how many people go straight to 180, they go over, and they only give one number. And companies will say, hey, if that's truly what you want, we don't want to waste our time. But if you do this overlapping band, they will not push you away. And the second part, why this is important, is because then it lets you negotiate at the end. It lets you negotiate at the end. So, negotiate at the end. Now, you might be wondering why exactly this is the case. Why does this work? Why do we have to do it that way? And before I get to how you should actually negotiate, the nitty gritty, let me give you the why as to why this works, because so many individuals forget to see the side of the company, meaning the company's perspective. In tech interviews, data engineering, software engineering, there's typically about, call it 6 to 8 1-hour rounds. The final round might be 5 hours. The first one might be 1 or 2. There's a recruiter round. Here's the thing. These interviews are probably taken by people making somewhere between $100 and $200 an hour, right? So just to interview you, right? Let's just say it costs $1,500 in man hours just to interview you. In order to find someone like you who they want to give an offer to, right? They probably need to go through at least 20, if not 30. Hi there. I hope you're enjoying the video. And if you are, please like, subscribe, and share, because it would mean the world to me, because then I can get this information out to more people, help more people break into this exciting space. Right. So right off the bat, we're talking about spending 30 to 45K in man hours to find you. By the way, if this process takes 3 months, there's an opportunity cost attached to it, right? Meaning them not finding somebody means their project can't move forward and they have to wait, and there's an opportunity cost. Oh, also, they might have hired a recruiting firm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, what many, many people don't understand is for these engineering roles, they are spending 50 to 100,000 just to find you. That's not even including your salary and your compensation. So, why am I saying this? I'm saying this for two important reasons. Number one, the reason you don't want to just give a number here in the top end is because they will genuinely turn you away. Because if they think that they can't afford you and they genuinely can't afford you, and that's generally what you're looking for, they're not going to spend 50 to 100 grand on you. It doesn't make sense for them. It just doesn't, right? They have to filter, and the recruiter's job is to save the time of the hiring manager, of the engineer, right, of the people that are higher up in the company, right? They're the gatekeeper. The second reason this is important for you to know, and this is why I wanted to stop for a second to tell you the why behind this, is because at the end of the day, not only are they trying to save money by not interviewing people that are asking for too much, but they also need to save money once they do give you an offer. And by the way, this is why they will negotiate, because if they give you an offer and you reject them, guess what? They have to do this whole process again. And they know they might have to spend an extra 50 to 100K just to find another you. And so chances are, if they've interviewed a ton of people, which by the way, in the data space, they get a lot of bad applications because everybody's doing Coursera courses and all this that just don't translate to real world experience. If they are seeing that they can't really find another quality candidate, guess what they'd rather do? When you get a job offer for about 150 and you tell them, hey, can you go up to 180? Guess what they're going to do? They're probably going to play ball, and they're probably going to negotiate. And maybe they'll go up to 180. Maybe they'll go up to 160. We'll talk about that in a second. But because of this, they know that you rejecting them just can't be an option, because it's going to cost more money to go find someone. Again, remember, opportunity cost, the time to go find someone is the time that you can just come in and start doing the project. That to them is a real thing. To the company is a real thing. So now that you understand the why, now you understand why you should negotiate and why you should only wait until the end, because the end is when you have the most leverage. And one more bonus tip as to how you should do it, obviously, and this is really obvious, so I'm not going to spend any time saying it. The more offers you have, the easier time you'll have negotiating. That's simple. So, with that said, let's translate into what you should do, right? Well, very simple. The things that you should do is when you do get the offer, you tell them, thank you, sound very grateful, and then you say, can I think about it? Because, and this is, and you don't just say think about it, because if you say think about it, they're gonna be like, why are you hesitating? You told me you love the company. You say thank you, you sound grateful, and you say, can I think about it? Because here's the thing, because it's a big decision for me, and I want to, I'm gonna spell a lot of things wrong here. I want to talk to my family since they are in town this weekend. That's it. They're probably going to give you an offer on a Thursday, on a Friday. You tell them, hey, I want to talk to my family. Is it cool if I get back to you in 1 or 2 days? And that's it. And the reason this is important is because it lets you think. You don't want to just say yes on the spot, because then it doesn't let you negotiate. All you want to do is take a step back, which then you can draft a very, very good email saying, hey, this is why I think I deserve to make an extra 20 to 30K in total compensation. Now, little pro tip, very important. A lot of people are always trying to negotiate the salary. Okay. Remember, there's also signing bonus and there's also equity. And so I'll make another video with these two things, because for a lot of people, they might not know what equity is, or they might not know what a signing bonus is. It's actually really important, especially at big tech companies and especially as you become higher up. But what I want to go over is what you should say in this email. In this email, all you need to do is go back to what we're talking about here, talking about your multiple offers. That's it. And I know what you might be thinking right now, but what if I don't have multiple offers? You always have multiple offers. So, what are the multiple offers? Well, number one, you probably have the multiple offers. Number two, you might have your current job. Remember, they probably don't know how much you make. Just say, hey, I've been thinking about, the compensation where I'm at right now isn't too far off. It would really have to be a little bit higher in order for me to make it worth it for me to go. But also, the other thing you have is other interviews. This is the one that I think most people forget. And you can easily draft up an email. Again, it doesn't have to be crazy. 1 to 2 paragraphs, 4 to 8 lines, where you explain, hey, by the way, I have 3 other final interviews coming up. I will stop them right now. And if you go up 30 grand, I will say yes today. And I will stop those other interviews right now. And that often times will show them like, hey, they're serious. Let's go. And by the way, the reason you need to sound grateful and say, hey, thank you, like this is my top choice, is because once you do give them this email that tells them, like, by the way, I'm ready to accept it if you go up 30 grand, you've already told them, like, hey, thank you, you're my first choice, let's go. They're going to take you serious. They're going to know you're not just using them to negotiate a different offer. And at that moment, they will probably either give you the 30 grand or they will come up. By the way, a little more of an advanced tip. If you really want to be aggressive, you can say something like 50 grand, hoping that they will come up 30 grand, because they won't always come up 100%, but they'll try to come up more than 50. So either way, the biggest mistake, going back to what we talked about at the beginning of the video, is just not negotiating.
Believe it or not, behavioral questions are the number one round where engineers fail the most. And so on this video, I'm going to show you 2 big don'ts and 2 big do's to do in the behavioral question round. And at the end of the video, I'm going to give you a massive bonus tip that a lot of people don't realize happens in the behavioral question round. So the first 2 things you should not do, or the first of the 2, I should say, is do not sound very, or go off on a very long tangent. So After consulting with over 1,000 clients, this is the number one thing that throws off the entire vibe at the beginning of an interview. And so what I mean by this is when a company asks something like, tell me about yourself, what I see a lot of clients do is they go off on a very, very long, I'm talking like 10, 15-minute scripted conversation. And a lot of the times they say something like, oh, well, my name is this, that, and that. I've worked at this company, that company, this company over the last 10 years. And I've worked with X, Y, Z, A, B, C tool. And I've done ACE, F, G project. And believe it or not, they end up going into the projects that they've done and the impacts that they made. And they've done the whole bazam. It's like literally they take their resume and then just go bam. And they just talk about it for 10 to 15 minutes. And a lot of the times it might just be, engineers being engineers, not having soft skills. Sometimes it's a cultural difference, right? But those things matter a lot because here's the thing. This right here is the first impression. So in that first impression, oftentimes what the person on the other side will do is they will just let you talk. And that's what I do with my clients. I'll ask them, hey, tell me about yourself. Because this is supposed to be literally 1 to 2 minutes, about 3 to 6 sentences, nothing crazy. But what I will do on purpose is let my clients ramble so that they can feel the awkwardness. And I get it. Sometimes they're nervous. Sometimes they talk a little more, but there's a difference between being nervous and talking for like 5 minutes versus talking for 15 minutes. If it's 15 minutes, oftentimes what happens is, immediately, okay, this is a little scripted. Because of that, the person on the other side is going to say, I don't know if they have the communication skills to do this job. Because here's the thing about data analyst, data engineer, cloud engineer roles that a lot of engineers still haven't grasped. It's not purely technical. It has a decent component of business smarts. And so you need to have the communication skills to actually talk with other stakeholders, other teams, etc. So for the love of God, do not answer this tell me about yourself question with a 10, 15-minute rant about your whole project history. They will get to it. They've seen your resume. They will ask questions. Have a natural conversation. So with that said, number 2, the time of the, minutes per question is one thing. How you actually come off is a whole nother. And so the number do not thing you need to do is sound robotic. I had a very, very charismatic client once. I'm not going to say his name because he might be watching and some of you might have seen his testimonial video, but he loved the kid, but he was actually very, very charismatic. And he went through like 10 behavior question interviews. And we were working really hard on the SQL and the Python and the cloud and the system design, right? And what was interesting is he kept on failing the behavior question round because we had to do an analysis at some point and say, hey, what's going on? Why, we've worked so hard, all this. Why do you keep failing the interviews? And then when we did the analysis, we figured out he had like 10 behavior question interviews that he just kept failing. And so what happened was when we actually looked at the videos, what we found was that he sounded very, very scripted, very, very robotic. And what's crazy about that is that he didn't know about it until he actually watched the videos. So if you get a chance, watch yourself actually go through these videos. So if you get a chance, watch yourself because that will actually tell you how you're coming off in an interview. And better yet, if you can send somebody else to watch yourself, I highly recommend doing that because they can give you an honest take of like, hey, I think you might be coming off not the way you come off in person, basically. So those are 2 tips. Don't sound robotic and don't go on long tangents. Now, for the do's, these are very, very, very simple do's. Number 1, and by the way, I can make a whole different video on this because it's a whole different topic, but use the STAR method. If you don't know what the STAR method is, Google it. I'm sure most of you already know it. It's very, this is situation, right? You describe the situation, you describe the task that you are assigned for, you describe the action that you take, and then what was the end result, right? Everything should be about 2 to 3 sentences long, right? Every piece. And so really you're looking about a 12 sentence, paragraph that you should have by the end of it. So assuming that you already know you have to do STAR, the top thing that you need to do is you need to create a good hook and a good ending. And what I like to do is I like to give the analogy of a movie, right? Imagine you go to a movie. What are the 2 things you're probably going to remember the most? You're going to remember the first couple minutes and how hooked you got to the movie. And then you're definitely going to remember the ending, because when you walk out of the theater, that's the first thing you're going to be thinking about and recapping, right? So what this means is when you look at the STAR method here, right, you got the S and you got the R. You have to give a good hook, meaning explain at a high level, right? Just explain at a high level, hey, what is the situation? What's going on? This is why it's impactful. We needed to figure out how to do X, Y, Z. Otherwise, the company was going to lose $100 million. Boom. See how I just hooked you? The ending has to be, okay, so we ended up doing this, right? We ended up doing our tasks. We ended up doing our actions. And then it resulted in us actually increasing our profits by 50%. And we actually made $50 million more than we thought we were going to do, right? And so the ending was also kind of a hook. And it actually goes into what I'm going to talk about in the next section. But this is what I call a quantifiable result. Okay? And so the quantifiable result is really the big do here. If you don't leave a quantifiable result, it's like leaving the movies and saying that was a pretty shitty ending. And so you need to leave a quantifiable result, because that's the last thing the interviewer is going to remember. And believe it or not, it's going to play a big role in the impression they had about you. So use the high level hook, give a good quantifiable result in your ending, and you should be good in terms of a good, proper story. Now, number 2, a really, really big do is create frameworks. And so what I mean by this is what a lot of people try to do is they try to go and look up on Glassdoor, hey, what kind of behavioral questions are there going to be? And the problem with that is you'll oftentimes find 50 questions, let's say, online. The problem with this is it's going to take you forever to write 50 stories. Okay? So what you want to do is, let's just say you do have 50 questions. What you want to do is you want to write, let's just say, keep it simple, 5 stories. Okay? And then each of these stories can take 10 questions. Right? Because the last thing you want to do is memorize 50 stories. Right? You don't want to memorize 50 stories, because that's going to get really, really confusing. And it's going to take a lot of time. But if you can come up with 5 solid stories and to say, okay, these 10 questions get bashed into this, these 10 over here, etc., then what happens is when you actually interview, you'll come off more natural, right? Because a lot of the times when people are too scripted, like right here, that's when you're going to come off robotic, scripted, nervous, not genuine, right? And again, you want to have a conversation. And so with that said, I'm going to add an extra bonus like I promised, and this is going to be massive given what I just said here. So the bonus is look at Amazon's leadership principles. And the reason I'm saying that, you can just Google it, right? There's about 14 of them. I think when I was there were about 12. The reason is because Jeff Bezos actually took these from Sam Walton, right? And Sam Walton is the founder of Walmart. And Sam Walton had taken it from, I think, Rockefeller or Carnegie or somebody, and they had taken it from somebody else. And believe it or not, if you actually dig deep into the mission, values, and leadership principles of most companies, I think Chewy is one of them, for example. Chewy's founder came from Amazon, and they took a lot of the leadership principles from there. I used to work at Lyft as well, Lyft actually has a lot of the similar leadership principles as Amazon. And so my point is, Amazon's leadership principles, and by the way, the reason I'm saying Amazon is because there's a ton of online data, right? A ton of data, a ton of use cases, a ton of stories already. So Google is your friend in that case. But Amazon is a really, really good foundation for you to do this off. And so what I'm saying is, if you had to use this method up here to batch, right? If we can connect this right here and say, hey, there's 14 leadership principles, let's create 5 stories, right? And now let's batch the 14 leadership principles. Maybe there's 3 over here, maybe there's 4 over here, maybe there's 2 over here, maybe there's 4 over here, right? Whatever, right? And so now what you're seeing is that your 4 stories, and maybe it has to be 6, maybe it has to be 4, right? It doesn't really matter. The point is, if you can create enough stories that answer all of these leadership questions, you should be in a good position. And yes, I know 5 to 6 stories sounds daunting because it could be seen as, creating 3 pages of stories. But trust me, the thing about behavioral question rounds is that it's in every single interview, right? Everybody is practicing something like Python for months and months and months at a time. But think about it. Python is only in 50% of the interviews for a data engineer or a data analyst. Actually, a lot less for a data analyst. Yet behavioral questions are in every single interview, every single round. And oftentimes, it's the round I see the most neglected by clients.
Here's how you're going to ace your Python interview round for data engineers specifically. So why am I prefacing it for data engineers? Because the number one mistake I see is that people think the software engineer Python round or object-oriented programming language round is the same as that as a data engineer. First things first, let me preface this by saying something really important and something that I think is a really big myth in the industry for data professionals, which is that the Python round or the coding round, whatever you want to call it, right? Some people do Java, C#, C++, whatever the case is. It's actually the least important round when it comes to you getting your first or next data related role. In fact, if you're going for a data analyst role, you might not even need it. If you're going for a data engineer role, you kind of need it 20% of the time. And I'll go over why I'm saying 20%. But the reality is it's not the same as a data engineer round. So let me give you a quick overview of why I'm saying this and why it's important for you to know. So in a data engineer round, you're going to have rounds like SQL, Python, AWS, data modeling, and something called behavioral questions. And you might have a few of those. If you're going for like a big tech company at Amazon, you might have 6, 7, 8 of those rounds. And you might have, let's say, behavioral questions twice. You might have a SQL round twice, maybe in the first round and in the second round. And that second round might have like 5 hours of interviewing, right? And so why am I saying this? Because you have to think about this mathematically. SQL and behavioral questions is all of a sudden, let's just say you have one of each here, it's all of a sudden 4 out of the 7 rounds. So the most important rounds you should focus on are SQL and behavioral questions. And in fact, because Data Engineer Academy has already helped over 1,000 people get into that next data role, we see the most common mistake, which is that people actually ignore the behavioral question round. Now, is it because it's, a bunch of engineers and analysts and a bunch of introverts in this crowd? Maybe. But the problem is it's actually one of the most important rounds because some companies actually have like 3 of these. Amazon is famous for having a bunch of leadership principles, leadership values, and behavioral question rounds. And so be very, very careful to not overstudy the technical stuff. So the reason I'm saying 20% is because even though this breakdown only has Python 1 out of 7 times, honestly, in a lot of interviews, you might not even get it. So honestly, I take that back. It's probably in 10% of interviews, right? It's less. So it's like 1 out of 10, if anything. Now, there are some exceptions. So I'll talk about that in a second. But my point is, be very, very careful to think that software engineer interview is the same as the data engineer. It's really, really, really not. And that's a really common mistake. And so here's what I see people do. They go on LeetCode. Again, no hate against LeetCode. We're not sponsored by them, and they only have 2 E's. But they go on LeetCode, and then they study for 2 to 4 months. Something crazy. Here's the problem with that. You're studying probably 80% of your study time is going to something that is going to come up 10% of the time. Think about that. If I had to curse my enemies and tell them, hey, let's make sure my competition focuses on the exact wrong thing that they shouldn't be focusing on, this is how I would do it. I would tell them, go do 200 LeetCode questions, which, by the way, I've had clients do that as well. So don't do this. Now, let me be very clear. Am I saying don't do any LeetCode at all? That's not what I'm saying. Okay? So listen to what I'm saying. In LeetCode, you have hard, you have medium, and you have easy type of questions, right? Again, let's go with Python, but you can do this with Java. You can do this with any object-oriented programming language. Here's the thing. Most engineers, data engineers, are going to have to prepare for something around here. Now, if you're going for a data engineer 3 role, right, maybe a lead data engineer, and it's for a big tech company that maybe they're really, really technical in their interviews, right? Maybe it is, a Airbnb, right? Maybe it is something where you have to go and study a little bit harder. But again, most people, what they do is they go do 50 or 150 questions here, 150 here, and 150 here. That's a big problem because A, if your question is most likely going to land here, you're overstudying by doing 300 here. And then if you're only going to do 10% of your interview rounds is going to be that, you probably don't even need 150. Maybe you need 50, and maybe you just need to do 1 a day as you're studying the other stuff, or even as you're applying or your applications are going out. You can just study 50 questions over 50 days, and you'll be good to go. So that's number 1. That's exactly how you should approach studying for this interview round. Now that we know this, and now that we know it's not the most important, right? It's probably the least important. With that said, you do have to be ready for that round, because if you do get it, you want to ace it. Now, I'll say one more thing before I move on. We have 5 rounds here. I actually call this, and I know it sounds simple, but a lot of people don't realize how, because I used to interview for Lyft and Amazon, so I can tell you, and startups, I can tell you what the grading criteria is. If there's 5 subjects, they're really looking for you to pass 3.5 for you to have a good chance of getting hired. So again, the reason I'm saying this is important, right, this stuff over here, is because if you can pass SQL, behavioral questions, and data modeling, right, if you can pass those 3, then you have a really good shot of getting hired already. So focus on the easier stuff, right, and make sure you get it down, because again, the common mistake I see with engineers is that they failed the behavioral questions part. And then that other 0.5 that remains, just try to get that within AWS/Python. So with that said, here is how you should study. What you shouldn't do is you shouldn't go do 300 questions on LeetCode. What you should do is you should learn what I call frameworks. And so there's way too much technical stuff to go over in just this short video. So I'll post another video soon. I'll make one for you that goes into the very technical stuff, such as what is a binary tree, what is a linked list, right, et cetera, et cetera. There's a really good book, I think. It's called Cracking the Coding Interview. Again, we're not sponsored or affiliated, but if you want that book, we'll put a link in the description so that you can go there and learn the frameworks, again, the frameworks for how to answer these questions. Because here's the thing. A lot of people, when they go do 300 LeetCode questions, what they're trying to do is they're trying to memorize the question. You're not going to memorize 300 problems. And even if you did, it's going to take you like 2 years. You don't want to spend 2 years doing this when you can do this in like 2 months. So the better way to do this is you learn the frameworks, the tactics, the strategies, the concepts, whatever you want to call it. I like frameworks because they're mental frameworks. And then whatever question you see, even if you've never seen it before, in practice,
If you see that question on an interview, you'll know how to at least approach it. So with that said, as promised, what is exactly going to be looked at on the interview? So here's the thing. Whether you get the right or wrong answer, that's only one box. And yes, I'm using box very much on purpose because they're not only going to look at this. It's not like you get the right answer and then they pass you for that round, or you get the wrong answer and you're eliminated. That's not what it is. What actually happens is they have a bunch of things they're looking for. And then based on all of those things, what they do is they say, okay, this person knows enough of the Python round, so let's pass them. So what are the things you're looking for? Well, number one is the answer right or wrong? Number two, I mean, this one's pretty simple. This one you just got to do. Do they know the language, right? If you go on there and you just don't even know how to do it, they're just going to reject you. Now, number three, are you talking out loud? And so one of the common mistakes I see is that when someone jumps into the interview, right, they just jump in, they get the question, they jump in, and they just start coding for 30 minutes. They treat it like a leak code question. The problem is what the interview wants to see is they want to actually see you collaborate. So how do you collaborate? You ask questions. You ask questions to the interviewer. You ask them for feedback on your approach. You tell them your approach before you even start to implement it. And then when they give you feedback or maybe hints, they see that you can be receptive to the hints. And if you're receptive to the hints, they're like, oh, okay, I can see myself working with this person. Because I say this all the time, but remember, humans hire other humans. It's not machines hiring humans, not yet at least. And so you want to come across as like, oh, this person can communicate, this person can collaborate, I want to work with this person. It's the truth. No one wants to say it, but it's the truth. There's biases in the human brain when they make a hire. So talk out loud, ask questions, collaborate. It's going to be super important. Now, one other thing you have to note, this is pretty important, it's code cleanliness. So what that means is whether you know the language or not is one thing. How it's presented is a whole different thing. So here's a litmus test. If one of your friends who writes very sloppy code gave you their code and you started reading through and it's like very messy and dirty and you're like, what is this? That's a sign of somebody that has bad code cleanliness. So be careful there because they're paying attention to that during the interview. Now, something else they're looking for. They're looking to see how you iterate through the problem. So what that means is they're not expecting you to write the code and then you run it for the first time and then it's correct, right? That's not how you want to do it. And again, a lot of people try to do that in leak code. What you should be doing is you should be running a little bit piece of code, run it, and then fix any error or add anything that's missing, run it again, and then keep doing that until it leads you to the right code. Okay? And so that's called iterating through the problem. And by the way, what's going to happen here, and again, they're checking for this, is can you debug? Can you debug the problem if you find that you got an error? So again, if you get like a bug here when you iterate, right, that's okay. Because if you can show, oh, wait a second, I missed this, or, oh, maybe I'm going to implement this instead of the first tactic, that's okay. You're showing them that you're a true engineer, that you can debug, and that you're not freaked out if something goes wrong. So that's another thing that they're looking for. And finally, they're looking for if you can handle the outliers, or in code, it's called the edge cases. So let's just say you write a solution, you get the right question or the right answer to the problem, right? What you want to do then is test, assure them that you got the right answer, and then what they're gonna do is they're gonna say, okay, but what if we add this, right? Add this one thing or add this second thing. And what they're saying is, well,
let's just change it up a little bit. Let's add an edge case. Let's add an outlier. Maybe, in code, in the real world, when you productionize code, but then you have a case that comes up that you didn't think about because it's hard to come up with every scenario. How are you going to tweak the code in order to actually adjust for this edge case that they just brought up towards the end of the interview? And if you can do this and you can account for that edge case, you'll be in good hands. And so that's the outliers, the edge case. And then there's other things, by the way. There's time and space, right? That's a whole different concept for a whole different video. Can you do O of N, for example? Again, look that up if you want or interested in. So there's a lot of things, but what I'm saying is the biggest mistake is people go into this interview, they get the question, they start speaking for 30 minutes, and in reality, they might head down the wrong path, or they're not doing these other things like code cleanliness that they are looking for. And then even if they get the right answer, the interviewer might think, wow, their code is very dirty and they were kind of rude and I don't want to collaborate with this person, and you still might not pass the interview round. The 3 things you should do, the 3 things you should not do in a SQL interview if you are going for a data analyst, data engineer, BIE, cloud engineer round. By the end of this video, you'll have clarity as to how you should come off during an interview, because it's not just about getting the right answer. So let's jump in. Number 1, the first thing that you should not do. Let's start with the nots, because this confuses a lot of people. The first thing you should not do is jump right in. So as weird as this sounds, the biggest mistake we see people make during an interview is they just jump right in and start answering the question. The reality is most people do that because they've been studying a bunch of leak code for the past couple months. The problem with that is if you just jump right into the question and you're not answering the actual question, you potentially can spend 20, 30 minutes of your valuable time during an interview answering the wrong thing. And so do not just jump in, because here's the thing. As interviewers, we are taught to just let you ramble. That's right. If you start interviewing and you start doing your code, we will let you continue because it immediately tells us, this person doesn't actually have experience in a real world environment. So let me tell you what you should do. You should ask a ton of questions. Okay? So you should ask a ton of questions during the SQL interview. Why? Because the interview questions might actually be very vague on purpose. And what they're looking for is to see if you have the ability to ask clarifying questions and probe a little more as to what their goal is, so that you can actually get the right context to then answer the right question quickly. And by the way, the problem with leak coding, again, you should do it. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but the problem with leak coding is that it's not necessarily how the interview goes. You don't just sit there in front of a computer coding for 30 minutes and then they grade you on how that went. That's not typically how it goes, right? They're trying to see if you can talk to a human in front of you, cross collaborate, communicate well, right? It's not just about the tech skills, right? So that's the first big do or don't. Now, I'm going to give you a second don't that is going to connect to the do that I just told you. The second don't is do not avoid hints. Okay? So don't avoid hints. Here's what I mean by that. I can't tell you how many times students ask a question just for the sake of asking the question because they've heard, I need to do that. Then the interviewer tells them something and then they just completely ignore it and keep going and doing whatever they want to do. Again, the point of cross-collaborating, working with other teams, working with your stakeholder, communicating well is to actually listen to what they're trying to say, work in groups with them, work as a team, and then pivot your approach, because whatever they're telling you, they probably have an answer in mind, which means they want to actually see if you can implement feedback. The second to do is actually what I would say, talk out loud. So here's the thing. talking out loud during an interview is going to let you do one of two things. Number one, if you go back here, it's actually going to help you ask clarifying questions. Okay. So talking out loud might actually trigger you to ask a question during the interview. But here's the other thing. If the interviewer sees you going the wrong path, then they might actually jump in and give you a hint. Let's say you do at the beginning of an interview ask a ton of questions, 20 questions. What a lot of people do after that is they start coding and then just never speak again. You have to not just ask a ton of questions at the beginning, you actually have to talk throughout the process and explain what you're talking about, because the interviewer there is there to help you. He's not trying to play games, play tricks on you. They're just trying to help you. The third thing you should not do during the SQL interview is you should not wait till the end to test. So the third thing you should not do during a SQL interview is do not wait until the end to test your code. I can't tell you again, they all kind of, you're going to see how all these do nots kind of play a role within each other, because a lot of people are doing a bunch of leak code and then just going off and, sitting in front of a computer during an interview, writing code for 30 minutes and then realizing, oh shit, I messed up somewhere along the way. It's too late. You don't have enough time to go back and fix it. So what you got to do is you have to test iteratively. So that's the third thing of what you should do is actually test iteratively. Okay. So there's actually a really, really smart way that you can go about testing iteratively. I call this method breaking up the question. You have a SQL question, right? It's asking you for A, B, C, D, right? And it's asking you to do, find the revenue for the last 5 years broken down by category, right? What you can do is you can break up the question. So you could take that question, break it up into 3 chunks, right? So now you know, hey, I need to find revenue. I need to find it for the last 5 years, and I need to break it down by category. Now, all of a sudden, what starts to happen is you start to create the pseudocode for every single piece of this question. Because now you know this is a sum revenue. This is a where clause, right? With the 5 years. This, for example, here is a group by statement, right? So when you actually break down the question, you create the pseudocode, make your life easier to actually write the code. And so with that said, I'm going to give you one little surprise bonus, right? And I think this bonus is basically the overarching theme. Now, if you're liking these videos, by the way, please subscribe, like, share, right? I want to make more of these videos, but only if I see that they're having value for people. The number one overarching theme of all of this is to remember this one thing. The grading for SQL is not just, did you get the right answer? Did you get the wrong answer? It's not that. All right, what's up, guys? Let's jump into the system design and AWS round for the data engineer interview. Today, we're going to talk about 3 simple things. Number 1 is frameworks. Number 2 is which AWS tools I recommend. And number 3 is which mistakes to avoid. I'll talk about that as we're going through the lesson. So, and by the way, yes, I get it. You can do GCP, Azure. For this session, we're just going to stick to AWS tools, but the same advice should apply. So, what do I mean by frameworks? That's number 1. So, frameworks are mental models for how to approach an interview. And the reason I think this is so important is because, again, I'm spelling that one wrong. One of the most common mistakes I see is people trying to memorize. So, don't try to memorize because it's just going to take too long, right? I see people doing Python and SQL preparation by trying to do a bunch of questions and memorize each one and then hope that they get on the interview. Chances of this are low. It takes a long time and it just frankly doesn't work. So, what's the framework I like to use for system design? It's actually very simple. It's something called trade-offs. So, as you are learning the tools, and again, I'll get to it in a second as to which tools you should learn. One of the things you should keep in mind is that with the system design round, there is no right or wrong answer. But instead, you want to think about it as a spectrum. So 0 is wrong, 1 is great. And usually, everything you recommend will have some sort of trade offs. What you want to do is you want to give an answer as close to a 1 as possible. So, I'll give you an example. Let's say that we are tasked with building a fraudulent machine learning system for American Express. I can sit here and, again, not to get too technical, but I can sit here and say, hey, the right way to do this is, put it in a data lake, put it in a Redshift data warehouse, and then query it and, put it in a dashboard and send out an alert, Here's the thing. Does this system work? Meaning, if I were to set up this system, is it technically feasible? The answer is, let's just write that here. Yes, it is technically feasible. But is it the best system? Well, if we go back to this spectrum here, I would say it's probably around here. Meaning, it's not the worst I've seen. It's definitely not the best. So, what is it that the interviewer is actually looking for? They want to see if you can identify this right here. What are the trade-offs to specific systems? And so, for example, you might say, okay, well, one way we can do this is this, right? You can talk about it, but then you can be like, but I don't actually like that. What I actually want to do is something like S3, Kinesis, right? So this is real time. And then you might say, hey, we want to do, SageMaker, which is basically saying we're going to use ML to detect the fraud because we want to do it. We want to detect the fraud in real time. And then we might send out alerts to the user using technology like SQS and SNS so that we can send a text message to the user. This, I'm going to go back to the spectrum thing, is a lot closer to what we wanted to do. So in this situation, and by the way, I forgot an important piece here, but in between here, we might do something called a Postgres database, right? So a Postgres database might be different than Redshift, which is up here. So basically, what we're going to be talking about here is, hey, we used a Redshift database versus a Postgres database. Why is one better than the other? The reason a Postgres database is better than a Redshift database in this situation is because in Amex transactions, we only want to pull one row of data, right? So we only want to pull one row of data at a time, i.e. the transaction that we think is fraudulent. So the system here, let's call this system number 2, is actually better because 1, we have real time machine learning going on. And number 2, it's using a database that will perform faster. Now, again, let me go back to Redshift here. Are we saying, or I should just put this actually, are we saying that Redshift data warehouse will not work? That's not what we're saying. It actually will work from a technical standpoint. It is feasible. What we're saying is it's not the fastest. It's not the most optimal. So in that case, there are trade-offs to each system that we're building. So if there's one word, and again, I like to repeat things because it takes the human brain about 9 times before they register something. If there's one word I want you to remember, it's trade-offs. What are the trade-offs of each system, of each tools, etc.? Tools, systems, architectures, right? That's the whole thing put together. I know I spelled that wrong, but you get my point. Because this is the thing that we want to talk about during the interview. By the way, just a side note, one of the mistakes aside from memorizing, that I see is people think that they're actually going to code or put up a system during the interview. You're not going to do that. There's not enough time. So, what you want to do is understand things conceptually, just like I'm showing you right now. So, I know what's going on in your mind. It's like, okay, well, if that's how we prepare for the interview, what about the technical stuff? Because, Chris, I have no idea what 7 of these tools are that you just mentioned. I get it. I get it. So, let me tell you the biggest mistake I see people make when it comes to preparing for the AWS round. Certifications. It's a hot topic. I think it's a little controversial. Should we do it? Should we not do it? I think certifications are great for learning. I don't think they're great for acing the interview. Here's the biggest reason why. These take 1 to 2 years to complete if you want to do them well, or if you want to do all of it. The certifications will teach you about, I'm exaggerating here, but let's say they're going to teach you 100 plus tools. Okay? Here's the problem with that. The interviews will probably require about, I don't know, 10 to 20 tools. And by the way, the real job really is going to require normally about 5 to 10 tools. So you're spending 10 times longer than you need to studying tools that probably aren't even going to be part of the interview. So that's my biggest problem with the certification method. It's not optimized for the end goal. So I know what you're wondering. Well, Chris, what should I actually study for the AWS interview? I'm going to give you a couple cheat sheets. So, ETL tools, I think understanding things like glue and airflow are important. I think understanding alerts. So, CloudWatch, SNS, SQS, databases / data warehouses. Again, I'm sticking to AWS, but you understand the point, right? You can do this for anything. So Redshift, Postgres, and look up RDS as well. Again, I'm kind of going quickly here, but these are kind of the main buckets. So you can do Kafka for real-time streaming, Kinesis, and let's just say something like that for ML. This is roughly the main 5 categories that I want you to take away. Again, am I saying this is the only stuff? Not really, because there's a lot of more important things, such as knowing things like VPNs and, uh, you know, what's it called? The gateways for how to set up the actual pipelines of data getting moved back and forth. But the reality is, this stuff is so rare on the interview. And so the point I'm trying to make is one thing you can do, which is, again, we have this data because we see people go through interviews every day. Reverse engineer the job description. If you reverse engineer the job description, you can pinpoint your studies towards the stuff up here. Now, again, yes, will learning, Snowflake and Databricks help? Yes. Is it on every interview that you're going to go through? No, not at all. Is Spark going to be on the system design interview? Probably not. So there's no right or wrong answer, and this is why it's kind of a tough lesson to give you advice. But what I can say is you don't need 100 tools. And this is the most common mistake we see people make. How to ace the data modeling interview round to get into a data engineering role. by the end of this video, you're going to have a massive advantage because I don't think I see a lot of people talking about how the data modeling interview is structured, how it goes, what the grading criteria is, and how you can actually prep for it in a very smart way. So let's jump into it. I'm going to give you what I call my frameworks so that you can learn and use these frameworks to study. And then by the time you actually approach your real interview, you can keep these frameworks in mind so that you know you're actually going to approach the problem correctly. So, what do I mean by frameworks? So, by frameworks, I mean this is how you should think about approaching a question. The wrong way to do it is if you memorize a data modeling question and then you go and try to reiterate it on the interview. The problem is you're never going to memorize 1,000 data modeling questions. It's just not going to happen. So what you want to do is you want to learn how to approach the actual question. Now, before I jump into the frameworks, let me quickly give you the problem statement. The problem statement can be something such as, hey, you work at DoorDash, right? Increase engagement at DoorDash, right? And so when we say increase engagement at DoorDash, right, we can say, hey, if we want to increase engagement, create a table, create the fact tables, the dim tables, etc. For the purpose of this video, I'm not going to go over what fact tables and dim tables are, but what I want you guys to start getting in the mindset of is what is the right way to approach a question that is very ambiguous like this. So the first thing you have to remember is it's ambiguous on purpose. So step number one is actually ask a ton of questions. So for example, and by the way, when I say ask a ton of questions, I literally mean 10 plus. 99% of clients we work with, 99% of people I talk to, they think a lot of questions means 2 or 3. I tend to go to 20. For this purpose, start with 10. So when I say increase engagement, I'm immediately asking questions like, what is engagement, right? What's engagement? In what time frame? What part of the app? Is it only in the US? Are we talking about mobile versus desktop? Are we talking about Android versus iOS? Right? Is it the holidays? Did we see a big dip in conversion? Did we see a lot of people start? Right? Do you see how I just rattled off 10 questions? That is a skill. And again, I'm telling you this from experience. We've helped 1,000 people at Data Engineer Academy, more than 1,000. This is the hardest part for people to grasp because their brain isn't accustomed to answering or asking these types of questions. And mind you, most of these were business questions. So I'm actually going to cheat a little bit right here. And I'm going to say, hey, if this was framework number one, here's framework, what I call framework number 0. And framework number 0 is dog food. So what does dog food mean? In business, dog food means you eat your own product. So in this case, what I would do if I had an interview coming up with DoorDash in 7 days, I'm using the product, the app, right? Literally 10 times in the previous 10 days, right? So use the app, use the product. Now, not every product is consumer facing. I get it, but you might have to use a proxy or you might have to do research online to see, okay, this is, what the user would experience. Because if I'm using DoorDash and I'm going through the app and touching every button and kind of starting to visualize, oh, this is the data that's being collected here. That's the data that's getting moved there. What I'm doing there is I am dog fooding. I'm using the product to understand what questions come to mind. By the way, here's a good one for you. If you don't use DoorDash, open up your Spotify, right? Like if I ask you, hey, increase Spotify engagement right now, what does that mean? Because you might think, hey, it's listen to more songs. Maybe it's listening to it longer. Maybe it's opening up the app in the first place. Maybe it's creating a playlist, right? So do you see how engagement in that case has 10 different meanings? But you're not going to know what questions to ask. Step number one, framework number one, if you aren't familiar with the product. And so before I go on to the other two frameworks, right, here is, and again, remember the goal is to create tables, right? That's what they're going to ask you to do. Hey, create a data model, create tables based on that question. Now, here is the number one mistake I see people make. The number one mistake is, and again, going with framework number one, they just start right? They just start answering. And this is problematic for a lot of reasons. Because let's say the interview is 30 minutes, the interviewer will very much on purpose not cut you off. And so if they see that you start answering the question, they're just going to let you ramble for 30 minutes. But if this is the right answer, right, and you're going like this and you start going off the wrong path, they're going to let you. And guess what happens at that point? You just wasted 30 minutes of the interview. So, what is the right way to approach it? It is to drastically focus on the first framework. Ask 10 questions, get a clarification as to what they're asking, and that way you can focus the rest of the time. If you ask questions for 5 to 10 minutes, you can focus 20 minutes on creating the tables. Now, number 2, framework number 2, is what I call a 3-word step, which is what's the goal. So, after you've asked questions, your job is to determine specifically what is the goal that they're asking. We already know they want to increase engagement. We already know that. After you ask questions, you have clarity as to what the goal is, and maybe the clarity is, hey, they want more people to um, search more restaurants, right? So not necessarily buy, by the way, just search more restaurants. Well, now, if we know that that's the goal, the second part of this, the second 3-word part here is define the metric, right? And the reason I say this is because people have such a hard time quantifying something and getting very clear as to what the goal is. If you work for a company right now, maybe you have objectives, maybe you have key results, maybe you have, goals that your team set for you for that quarter, for that year, whatever. Notice that there's always a number attached to it. It's going from X to Y. That's what we want to do here. Maybe it's saying, hey, instead of searching, every user per day searches 2 restaurants per day, we want to increase that to 4. So maybe we come out with some ML algos that increase the number of recommendations and make it more personalized. Maybe they know based on what neighborhood I'm in, I should be looking at that restaurant, this restaurant, that restaurant. Maybe they see I order a bunch of sushi and I want to, recommend this person more sushi restaurants, whatever the case is, right? But once we have that, then the final step is to actually create the tables, right? Create the tables, create the fact tables, the dim tables, and say, hey, based on what I know the metrics are, based on the questions above here, what are the right tables to actually create? And that's when you create your fact tables, your dim tables, right? And you create your primary keys and you attach the tables to one another, etc. That part's pretty easy. I'll add an extra bonus here, an extra bonus framework, and that is tie back to the question. Okay. So tie back the tables that you just created to the question for the end of the data modeling round. Why is this important? Because a lot of times people will start creating tables because they're just used to those tables from previous work experiences, but then they realize they don't actually answer the question. Or even worse, they might create questions that answer, oh, I know that DoorDash wants to sell more food. So let me create tables to sell more food. But think about it. We just spent this entire video saying how important it is to ask questions and to define the metric. Because the metric in this situation is that you have to increase the number of restaurants that a user is looking at per day. So if your tables, and again, this is why I'm calling this the bonus round, if your tables from this framework number 3 doesn't answer that metric in that question, they will deduct points. Remember, and I'm going to leave you with this, they are making this question right here, right? They're making the question, where is it? Increase engagement. They're making that question ambiguous on purpose. They want to see how you think. They want to see how analytical you are. They want to see what kind of questions you ask. So if I have to leave you with one final thing, this right here, I'm going to circle it in pink, is the most important thing you can do heading into the data modeling mock interview. Get ready to ask a bunch of questions, flex that muscle, and get ready to go. So, if you want to see more rounds like this, more questions like this, do me a favor, subscribe, like, share the usual, whatever is said, and click on the link below, book a call with me or my team. We're going to see if you're a good fit for our one-on-one personalized training program to see if we can give you advice just like we did today on the data modeling stuff that you really can't learn in a textbook. You really do have to have somebody else teach you and guide you the way, or even if it's through videos just like the ones you watch. Because again, you have to train your muscle, just like we talked about in framework number, I think it was number 1. Asking questions is a muscle. And so if you are interested in getting help, totally cool. For now, we have a bunch of resources on the website. Click on the link below, book a call, and we'll see you on the other side.